Have you ever wondered why Hulk has such a minor role in all the Avengers movies, or why Captain Marvel only appears for a few seconds in Endgame even though she was introduced as the big savior? Or even, why is Sentry, the most powerful hero in the MCU, now a new Avenger and also relegated to not using his powers? And this has been going on for a few years now. It feels like whenever Marvel gets their hands on a character who's a bit too powerful, they tend to totally panic and make sure to reduce their powers so that they never actually use them. And these aren't the only cases. Thor became obese, Guy disappeared, and even Adam Warlock is a childish idiot. Marvel has no idea how to handle power, and that's just with the heroes. It's even more ridiculous with the villains. That's why I chose to explore how Marvel manages its characters' powers, working with my friend Captain Bambino. Like in manga, comic book superheroes constantly try to outdo each other. New villains must be stronger, and heroes must keep surpassing themselves. Like going Super Saiyan 62, you get the idea? Except in the MCU, well no, they prefer to consult and allow Sam to defeat Red Hulk. Anyway, in this video we're mainly going to talk about past projects, but just in case, we're still entering the spoiler zone, the danger zone. You're with Kevin Bukart, your favorite theorist from your favorite Deus Ex Machina intro. The MCU was built brick by brick. And I'm not sure that Kevin Feige, when launching Iron Man and the Incredible Hulk, ever imagined he'd still be at Comic-Con 20 years later. That's why, unlike mangaka, there was never a precise 20-year plan to build our hero's journey. Nor did anyone imagine decades in advance the villains they would face, especially in a universe like this. The problem is, over the years, the heroes have faced totally unequal threats. Captain keeps fighting another super soldier, while Thor is smashing gods. And when they come together, it's not always easy to find a balance. And yet, it all started off so well. The era of the Nemesis. In its early days, Marvel Studios established a very recognizable narrative structure. Each hero faces an antagonist who is almost their mirror image, to the point where you could see them as evil versions of the protagonist, which explains why some villains are sorely lacking in character. In fact, that's one of the main criticisms of this phase of the MCU. Unremarkable antagonists, often reduced to simple negative reflections of the hero, same abilities, same level of power. A few details change, but rarely any real fundamental differences. Take Obadiah Stane in Iron Man. He embodies everything Tony Stark used to be. Power-hungry, driven by his ego, he becomes Ironmonger, literally a beefed-up version of the Mark I. Basically, it's Iron Man against what Tony's Iron Man could have been if he hadn't had a conscience. The case of Thor and Loki follows a similar logic. Their family bond adds complexity, but the parallel is clear. Same appearance, same way of speaking, Thor embodies honor and courage, Loki cunning and betrayal, two sides of the same coin. Same thing for the Abomination in the Incredible Hulk, who is just another enraged Hulk. Visually and physically, it's almost like a game of spot the difference. Not to mention Captain and Red Skull, where each defends an ideology and thinks they're on the right side. Well, even if Schmidt is, but this approach doesn't come out of nowhere. It takes inspiration from stories where the hero battles both an enemy and himself, like Luke Skywalker in Star Wars, tempted by the dark side. For example, Frodo in The Lord of the Rings struggles with the ring's influence. This duality, common in pop culture, clearly influenced the MCU's creation. Still, the first phase stays true to classic comics. A hero, a villain, a final battle, good triumphs. In the end, a simple structure, almost textbook, but logical when it comes to laying the foundations of a larger universe. And overall, the handling of power works well. The fights remain balanced, often physical, hand to hand. At that time, superheroes are rare, marginal in a world still very close to ours. Being a hero is the exception, not the norm. There's no need for cosmic threats or extreme power. The heroes are only 2 or 3 times stronger than average humans. Thor and Hulk are obviously exceptions, and Captain America too, to a lesser extent, but we still stay on a human scale. No reality manipulation, no universe to save. They're still just superhumans. We should also recognize the benefits of this approach. Faithful adaptations of the great comic book villains, a solid setup, but the downside is a certain predictability. Each movie follows the same arc. The heroes go through a crisis, evolve, become better, face a mirror image threat, and gain maturity. You often find the love interest, the loyal friend, and a villain who only really becomes a threat in the final act. And the final battle always happens right before the credits. What makes these origin stories sometimes a bit tedious to rewatch. Another characteristic of this phase, modest stakes. The plots are often local or intimate. A good part of Thor takes place in a small town in New Mexico. Iron Man stays centered around Stark Industries. These smaller settings allow for character development, but somewhat limit the sense of scale. However, there are two exceptions. Once again, Thor and Hulk. Thor, thanks to Mjolnir, is almost invincible. He controls lightning, has immense strength, and at that time, in a still limited MCU, he was the strongest. Hulk, on the other hand, is potentially the most powerful, but his instability holds him back, just as Stan Lee intended, like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Bruce Banner rejects Hulk, which means he's used sparingly and in a controlled way. He's not always there when you need him, and that limits his role in the story, but in this case, it's completely intentional. It's part of the character, and it makes the emergence of his power feel truly mythic. The Avengers changed the game. Starting with the Avengers movie in 2012, Marvel Studios changes its approach. The stakes are higher. Now it's not just a single antagonist, but an entire army, a collective threat. Avengers clearly establishes this logic. The Chitauri, more than Loki, are the real threat. In most of the films that follow, the villain is no longer the center of the danger. Together, the Avengers form a team that's too powerful for a single villain to stand a chance. It's hard to imagine an enemy defeating Hulk, Thor, Iron Man, and Captain America at the same time. Except by bringing in a colossal supervillain like Thanos, whom Marvel kept in reserve, especially since, at the time, they didn't yet have the rights to the villains from X-Men, Spider-Man, or the Fantastic Four, so the choices were much more limited. And in the first, Thor Hiddleston impresses everyone so much with his performance that Feige decides to bring him back for the Avengers movie, even though he was really supposed to die in Thor. Well, after all, Avengers is clearly not focused on him. His development is pretty superficial compared to the first Thor, and his power doesn't really progress. Except for the Mind Stone, which he uses in a limited way, mainly to control Selvig and Clint Barton. Very quickly, we understand that Loki alone is no match for 6 Avengers. Even less so against Hulk, as seen when Hulk crushes him effortlessly. The real battle is against the Chitauri invasion. The movie becomes Avengers versus an alien army, not Avengers versus Loki. But they still had to keep him alive long enough for him to remain a credible threat, while keeping Hulk out of the way for almost 2 hours. Banner still gets a fair amount of screen time, since he appears for 12 minutes and 30 seconds, while Hulk himself doesn't even appear for 5 minutes. This may be the first real case of managing a character too powerful for the story. And this pattern will repeat. In Captain America, the Winter Soldier, the threat is Hydra's infiltration, not Alexander Pierce and his 12 minutes of screen time. The same logic applies in Iron Man 3. Aldrich Killian is barely present, but the enemy is the entire Extremist program. It's the same for Thor, the Dark World, where Malekith and his 10 minutes are overshadowed by the Dark Elves as a group. The hero no longer fights a single figure, but an organization, an ideology. And it's convenient to hide the lack of individual power of the villains and to broaden the stakes to more political or social dimensions. And that further reduces their screen presence. Whereas in Phase 1, an Obadiah Stane had 21 minutes, Loki 22, Red Skull more than 15 here, the villains become almost secondary. Another issue is the lack of memorable fights. Between 2013 and 2015, few confrontations remain memorable. Marvel has to make its own heroes fight each other to make up for it, like Hulkbuster vs. Hulk or Captain vs. Bucky, which remains one of my favorite fights. Then comes Avengers, Age of Ultron, which tries to take things up a notch. Ultron, an artificial intelligence, represents a brilliant threat on paper, unstoppable because he's immaterial. But he gives him a body and an army of robots, yet another army, which makes him just another physical enemy to smash, diluting the original idea. That being said, in terms of power, Ultron remains the most formidable enemy in the MCU at the time of the film's release. There's clearly a step up since Avengers 1, but unlike in the comics, they've turned his cold cruelty into weird goofiness. I can't physically throw up in my mouth. You're not funny, you don't even make me laugh. Jokes every time he appears, that's a no. But anyway, that's not the point. To face him, Marvel strengthens the team. Vision, Wanda, and Quicksilver join the Avengers. Vision, powered by an Infinity Stone, becomes the most powerful character in the universe. He's even able to lift Thor's hammer, which weakens Thor's image a bit by making him seem more vulnerable. A vulnerability that will be fully exploited in all the projects where he appears. Wanda, on the other hand, introduces a new form of power, psychic, magical, mental, capable of manipulating minds and reality. A new kind of force in the MCU, subtle but immense, even if still restrained at this stage. With the Age of Ultron, Marvel is laying the groundwork for an enemy capable of facing the Avengers alone, Thanos, but for that, a larger, even more powerful team is needed. The problem is, the more heroes you have, the harder it is to maintain balance. If the villain is too weak, they're swept aside. If they're too strong, it throws the whole movie off balance. But it's really the internal balance that's the main issue. How do you get a god, Vision, well, a witch, to share the same battlefield as an archer and his spy girlfriend? And yes, that's what the armies are for, because they're unequal too. But how long can that work? Because the increasing number of projects makes things harder to keep coherent. Though they've done well so far and found some tricks to stay on course. The Civil War arc, I think that's when we first see a real sign of the MCU struggling to manage the power of its characters. And the best example to illustrate that is Hulk. From phases 1 and 2, they had found tricks to keep him out of the plot, sometimes in more or less believable ways. The imbalance was still manageable up until Captain America, Civil War. In Civil War, Hulk's presence would have completely skewed the conflict between the two sides, and that's obvious. He and Thor were too powerful for the confrontation to be believable. Marvel simply leaves them out. Their mere presence would have crushed everyone and killed all dramatic tension, and Marvel prefers to have them fight each other in another movie. We already saw that in Avengers 1, where Hulk is deliberately kept out of the action for a good part of the movie. In Avengers 2, he's a bit more present but still stays in the background, barely 5 minutes on screen, even though he's supposed to be an integral part of the team. Thor also leaves on a solo mission in a vague subplot, mainly just to remove him from the story. He even ends up being less important than Clint Barton, which seems totally absurd. But let's move on to when Civil War comes around. Marvel anticipates the problem and decides to send Hulk into space. And if you think about it, this scene isn't really believable at all. You might wonder why Stark, with all his satellites, drones, AIs, and other cutting-edge armors, can't manage to intercept this Quinjet. The ship drifts through space, enters a wormhole, and ends up on the Grandmaster's planet, as if that made sense. In reality, it's not a narrative choice, it's a necessity. Marvel absolutely had to find a way to take Hulk and Thor out of the game. This need to sideline them shows just how hard it is to integrate them smoothly into the plot without throwing everything off balance. Fortunately, Marvel managed to bounce back with Thor, Ragnarok, a lighter, more fun movie that finally brings Thor and Hulk together in an isolated setting far from the chaos of the Avengers. This helps bring some order back to everything. But let's get back to Civil War. This movie marks a turning point. For the first time, we move from a classic setup, heroes versus villains, to heroes versus heroes. Marvel understands that it's becoming complicated to come up with villains who can match the already established superheroes. So the solution is to have them fight each other. Simple but effective, and it works. We finally have balanced fights, designed according to power levels. The arrival of Spider-Man and Black Panther adds even more depth without breaking the overall balance. They're not the strongest in the MCU, but they add depth to both sides, like Ant-Man. And maybe it's the first time a Marvel showdown has kept a genuine balance of power between two sides this strong. And then there's Zemo. Unlike Ultron, whose potential was a bit wasted, Zemo is a memorable villain precisely because he doesn't try to be strong. He's a strategist, clever, and understands very well that he can't defeat the Avengers physically, so he chooses to destroy them from the inside.
An empire defeated by enemies can rise again. Rise again. But the one that collapsed from within, that's dead. Dead. Forever.
He's one of the few who acts intelligently, who manipulates without thinking he's superior. It's subtle, well thought out, and it works. A real breath of fresh air in an MCU that was starting to repeat itself. And it's a shame that Marvel didn't continue down that path. After that, we quickly fall back into the charmless villain, defeated in 2 scenes, convinced he's brilliant while he fails miserably. Always more muscles, but often soft-boiled eggs, in an almost embarrassing state of denial, but we're not there yet. Finally, powerful villains. Starting in 2016, Marvel enters what is probably its most accomplished period in terms of storytelling, handling stakes, and escalating threats. Between 2016 and 2018, the MCU introduces antagonists far more formidable than those from the earlier phases. We are no longer simply dealing with mirror image adversaries for the heroes, but with entities of colossal power, bringing dangers of an entirely unprecedented scale. Faced with these threats, the heroes must adapt. It's not just about strength now, but about teamwork, intelligence, and sometimes cunning. That's why small, close groups form to tackle these challenges together. While the Guardians of the Galaxy set the stage, it's in Guardians of the Galaxy Vol. 2 that it truly takes form. The team faces Ego, a cosmic entity literally embodied by a living planet. It's a turning point. Brute force is no longer enough. Their victory relies on complementary strengths, sacrifice, and collective intelligence. Mantis, Nebula, Kraglin, not to mention Yondu, join the ranks. It's together that they manage to win where none of them would have succeeded alone. Thor. Ragnarok continues this logic. Hela is the first enemy to truly overpower Thor. Her power is such that the god of thunder doubts himself, suffers, and comes close to death. This movie marks an important milestone for Thor, who has to find his worth outside of Mjolnir. Once again, the solution comes from an improvised group: Hulk, Valkyrie, Loki, Korg, and Meek, and from a radical choice, triggering Ragnarok through Surtur to defeat Hela. A last resort plan far from classic confrontations. In Black Panther, Killmonger represents another kind of threat, less cosmic but just as deep. He shakes Wakanda, shaking it from the inside. It's not just the duel that matters, but the resistance of part of the people, T'Challa's self-questioning, and what his opponent represents ideologically. Like Hela, Killmonger seizes power, forcing the hero to redefine himself in order to regain control. Doctor Strange introduces Dormammu, an extra-dimensional entity, and once again, the victory is not physical. Strange traps Dormammu in a time loop, forcing him to flee. It's original, clever, and it diversifies the way the MCU resolves its conflicts. Each movie adopts its own tone, its own style, with its own variety of enemies. It's a period where every project has a real identity. All these movies form what can be considered the golden age of the MCU. The stakes keep getting higher, but the storytelling remains under control. The heroes are often outmatched on paper, but they manage to get through thanks to their cunning, their teamwork, or simply a good idea. This is what allows this formula to remain credible despite the interconnectedness of the MCU. It's because the conflicts stay isolated. Each threat takes place in a specific setting, apart from the rest, like the planet Ego, Asgard, Wakanda, the Dark Dimension, the Mirror Dimension, and so on. These places help justify the absence of the other heroes, because otherwise, we might wonder why the Avengers don't show up every time a cosmic entity appears. It makes it possible to balance the rise in power of the villains with the coherence of the shared universe. Marvel manages to make titanic threats coexist with logical solutions without losing track, and we can hope that this approach will serve as a model in the future. Notably with Fantastic Four. First Steps, which should introduce us to Marvel's first family facing Galactus, the Devourer of Worlds. An inevitable enemy and a new test for the MCU. Infinity War, Marvel facing its contradictions. Marvel Studios reached a kind of peak with Avengers Infinity War in 2018. It's the ultimate culmination. All the heroes introduced so far gathered in a single film. The enemies kept getting stronger until Thanos, the nearly unstoppable antagonist. In this film, the heroes struggle and have no hope of winning. The studio wants a blockbuster uniting these characters, but faces a problem. If all the most powerful heroes are there, Thanos can't win. And so the story can't reach the desired dramatic conclusion, the villain's victory. This is where we reach the limit of the Marvel model. A villain that's too strong crushes everything. A villain that's too weak doesn't hold up. And that's the whole paradox. Marvel needs its powerful heroes to make its threats believable. But once they're present, these heroes become obstacles for the story. So they have to be sidelined, weakened, or have their roles reduced. Let's look at this character by character. Hulk has always been a headache. Right from the intro scene, he's humiliated by Thanos, and as usual, his power level is unclear. Sometimes he's invincible, sometimes he's useless. After his defeat, he disappears from the film. Actually, from the MCU as a whole. Banner takes over without any really convincing explanation. And the idea is supposed to be that Hulk is ashamed or afraid, but it's very vague. As a result, he's written out of the story. Vision is the same, stabbed right at the beginning by one of the children of the Black Order. He's injured and taken out of the game. The film needs to remove the Mind Stone from him, so they keep him in the background. He never really takes part in the action. Wanda follows the same path. She protects Vision, then tries to find him, to defend him, so she arrives very late on the battlefield and doesn't intervene much. Her role is mainly emotional through her relationship with Vision. Thor, on the other hand, is treated much better. Ragnarok had already started a shift. He loses his father, his mother, his kingdom. And in Infinity War, he also loses his people. Loki, Heimdall, he's broken. A classic power-up, shonen style. To face stronger opponents, you have to become stronger. And it works. His late return shifts the fight and creates one of the MCU's most iconic scenes. If he'd arrived earlier, the Wakanda battle would have ended quickly. But his late arrival makes sense. It's built up and justified. Unlike Hulk, Thor actually has real character development in this movie. In fact, it's a very comics-accurate film. We find the classic structure of major comic book arcs: a final boss, Thanos, intermediate henchmen, the Black Order, and an army to defeat, the Outriders. Each level of threat corresponds to a tier of heroes. Thanos isn't just powerful, he's almost too powerful, and he also grows stronger as the movie goes on, until he becomes omnipotent. And to prevent him from destroying everything without resistance, Marvel gives him a moral code. His motivations are twisted, sure, but understandable. He doesn't kill all the heroes because he chooses not to, not because he can't. That's important. If Thanos were just a limitless monster, there wouldn't be a story. But it also shows a limit to the model. There are beings stronger than Thanos, especially in the multiverse. But those entities are untouchable. You can't really fight them, nor can you really defeat them, and they become unusable in a story with human heroes, except for one very specific exception. Captain Marvel, or the beginning of the problems. With Avengers Endgame approaching, Marvel pushes its ambition to the extreme by introducing what is supposed to be the most powerful character in the universe, Captain Marvel. From the post-credits scene of Infinity War, she is teased as a female heroic figure and above all as the ultimate hope against Thanos. A bold choice, because after the crushing defeat of the Avengers, the audience needed a boost, and that glimmer of hope was her. However, from her very first movie, we understand that there is a problem. The villains who seem to be the Skrulls are actually the Kree, and no one is powerful enough to stand up to Captain Marvel, so she's simply nerfed for 90% of the movie. Here, it's intentional. They're unsure how to handle someone so powerful, as shown by the absurd display of power. They could have had her gradually master her powers like Wanda, but no, she's at 8,000% right from the end of her movie. So what do you do with her? How do you make her character grow? Well, that's a real question. But before talking about that in Endgame, we can see that the handling of the characters, which was pretty well managed in Infinity War, starts to go off the rails here with the return of Thanos from the past. Hulk, who has become Smart Hulk, is drained of his appeal. Neither strong nor useful, he now seems less powerful than Iron Man or Captain America. Vision is dead, Wanda is absent, and Thor becomes a joke, a caricature of himself. Depressed, overweight, almost ridiculous. The change seems almost abrupt, disconnected, like an obvious way to nerf him. At full strength, Thor could have easily beaten Thanos, especially since this Thanos lacks the gauntlet and stones. So they deliberately weaken him, they sideline him, and what could have been the hero's big comeback turns into a complete joke. This will be confirmed and emphasized in Love and Thunder, and that's where Captain Marvel comes in. You quickly see the writers don't know what to do with her. She's too powerful and decisive, making it impossible to integrate her without unbalancing the story. It's like the Hulk issue, but worse. Because at least with Hulk, you could use Banner as an excuse, juggle with his dual nature. It wasn't ideal, sure, but it worked. For Carol Danvers, there's nothing. No credible reason to keep her out of the action, so Marvel comes up with a pretext. She's busy elsewhere, protecting other galaxies, except Thanos is threatening the entire universe. The excuse doesn't really hold up, and her screen time, just 6 short minutes in a 3-hour movie, only makes that impression stronger. We're sold the ultimate savior, and she's absent almost the whole time. And when she does show up, she's the one who completely turns the situation around. She destroys the ship and stops Thanos from snapping. But yes, it's too much. Wasn't there a middle ground? And the mask comes off. Marvel already doesn't know how to handle its most powerful superheroes. Using Captain Marvel right from the start would have risked ending the story in 5 minutes. But keeping her out of the game makes her inconsistent. She becomes a problem, revealing a deeper imbalance in the Marvel universe. This is where one of the MCU's biggest problems really begins, the inability to properly balance the power levels of its characters, especially the newcomers. If they're too strong, they become unusable, too weak, and they're insignificant. And in a world now saturated with superheroes, it's so difficult to make them coexist. What's the point of Captain Marvel fighting the Kingpin or Daredevil fighting Zeus? And at the same time, it always leads us to one-upmanship. Yes, it's cool to introduce increasingly powerful characters, but Marvel is going to lose its way, because not only do they not know what to do with these powerful characters, they'll never have the guts to give them threats that are up to their level. Because ultimately, it's a villain issue. If they're too strong, we question why every hero doesn't show up. If they're too average, it just feels repetitive. So, we're at a dead end, the stakes don't work anymore, and that's exactly what we'll see together in part 2 next week. Believe me, part 1 was the nice part. Because since the beginning of the multiverse saga, the problem has become a huge mess that Marvel can't get rid of anymore. Anyway, if you haven't seen my latest video about the upcoming movies after Secret Wars, it's right here. We'll meet again next week for part 2. And meanwhile, remember to stay curious. That's the key to happiness. Bye.